now talking about the pressure volume loops and valvular disease. First, we're starting with the aortic stenosis over here. The aortic stenosis basically means there is a problem with the aortic valve that is over here. It's stenosed. The opening is smaller than the usual, smaller than the expected, so it's hard to push the blood through the aortic valve from the left ventricle. So this is the left ventricle. This is the right. This is this is the left atrium. This is the right atrium, and here is the right ventricle. So this is the aortic valve, and it needs to be open freely in order to allow the blood to move easily from the right ventricle into the aorta. Here's the aorta, and it goes into circulation. But in our case, the disease is aortic stenosis, so this valve is stenosed and is not allowing the left ventricle to push freely. It's really hard for the left ventricle to push through the aortic stenosis. So we have two graphs. The first one is what we're going to compare it to the first graph that we have seen over here and we talked about. So we decided that the it's not that we decided, it is the black circle is the normal circle, is the normal expected circle in usual human beings without any disease. But the diseased circle is the one for a person, is the pink curve. The whole pink curve is for someone who has aortic stenosis, while the other part is basically the same thing as this part. Okay, so I just copied it and put it in here just to make it a little bit easier without going up and down. So for the first graph, for taking a look, so we know first, let's remember the normal. The normal we had over here an end diastolic volume. We'll talk about that. And end, oh, that was end systolic volume over here. End systolic volume over here and diastolic volume. So what was happening here, there was the filling of the ventricle, of the left ventricle. So that was during diastole. Remember we had the rapid filling and then reduced filling. So there it was, the filling. There you go. And then over here, the aortic, the mitral valve closes. Mitral closes, that's the normal. And then we start the isovolumetric contraction. That is contraction of the left ventricle, but actually without any change in the volume, because the volume is not leaving. So there you go. There was, let me draw it over here. So we had this closed, then we had filling of the left ventricle from the left atrium, and then when the filling is done, the mitral valve closes, and now we have a contraction of the left ventricle, but without any decrease in volume because both valves are closed. So this is the isovolumetric contraction, isovolumetric contraction. And then we had over here, in under normal conditions, the aortic valve opens, so in order to allow the blood from the left ventricle to move out into the aorta, and that's when the systole or the ejection phase starts. That's also under normal conditions. So the ejection phase starts over here and ends up when the aortic valve closes. So there you go. This is the aortic valve. Now it has, the blood has moved from the left ventricle into the aorta, into the circulation, and then the aortic valve closes to prevent the backflow of the blood into the left volume. And of course, we know that there's always some amount of blood in the left ventricle that doesn't leave the heart. It's always there. Okay, so now we have, again, both valves are closed and the left ventricle is preparing itself to be filled again, because now it's kind of empty of blood. So it starts relaxing and taking some rest, but actually there is no change in volume because both valves are closed. So this is the isovolumetric relaxation. There you go. Oh, let me use the right one. So there you go. This is the normal isovolumetric, so there is no change in volume, but relaxation, so there is reduction in the tension of the ventricular wall. So that's the normal circle. So at the end of the isovolumetric relaxation, there is the end systolic volume and systolic volume over here, and then at the end of filling there is the end diastolic volume, and these are the normal conditions. So in our case, in the aortic stenosis, what we have is the problem, as we said, is with the diseased, just a color, yeah. So the disease is within the aortic valve. It is stenosed, so it's really hard for the left ventricle to push through it. So what is going to happen is that we are feeling fine and everything until we get to the mitral closes. When the mitral valve closes, now it's the time for there you go, the mitral now first, there you go. The left ventricle is filling and everything is fine. This is closed, everything is fine. So it's filling through the left, through the mitral valve, and the mitral valve decides to close because now the left ventricle is full of blood and everything is fine and needs to push. So before pushing, before opening the aortic valve, the left ventricle needs to do the isovolumetric contraction in order to increase the pressure within the left ventricle to push open the aorta. So the trial to increase what is happening here is that this isovolumetric contraction is gonna last longer than expected. So the blue color is the diseased process. This is during the aortic stenosis. So the aortic valves should have opened here, should have opened over here, but now it's delayed. Let's say it opens over here, but because the problem is that the left ventricle needs to push even harder to push that aortic valve open because it's stenosed. It's not easy to open the aortic valve. So now we need to push harder in order to open it and allow the blood within to flow into the aorta. So that's why there is a delay in the aortic valve opening. So, and after the aortic valve opening, there is the ejection. Okay, there is the ejection phase. Oh, let me use the blood color as you decided. So the blue color is the diseased process. So this is the diseased ejection during aortic stenosis. You can notice that the ejection in the aortic stenosis is much shorter than the ejection under normal condition. And the reason for that is even though the aortic valve has opened, but it's still stenosed, so it's gonna close really fast. Like it opens, it allows some blood to go outside into the aorta, but it's still stenosed, so it would easily close again. So that's why the ejection phase is really small, and then we start again. The ventricle starts the isovolumetric relaxation, and that is just reduction in the pressure of the walls without any changing, because the mitral valve is also closed, so this is a closed chamber, but the left ventricle starts relaxing, so this is the isovolumetric relaxation. And if we can think about it, then of course, because the ejection was too short, there is an increased end diastolic volume. There is an increased blood amount that stays within the left ventricle, not leaving it. And this is quite obvious over here because this is the normal. Oh wow, no, this is the normal amount that stays at heart usually, but now in the diseased process in aortic stenosis, this is the amount of blood that stays in the left ventricle. So the left ventricle now contains even more blood after the ejection, and that is of course abnormal. And the other abnormal thing is that the stroke volume, that is the amount of the blood leaving the heart, it should be this size, it should be this red color, that is the stroke volume, that is the normal condition. But in our abnormal condition, so there you go, this is the stroke volume, it's really smaller amount leaving the left ventricle during systole due to the aortic stenosis. So that's for the first graph. For the second graph, it's just the same as this one, as I said, so nothing different. So it's the relationship between time and between blood pressure. So what we have, the pink curve is saying that is the aortic pressure. So this is, let's say, aortic pressure, and the blue line represents the left ventricular pressure. This is the left ventricular pressure, and the green line is the atrial pressure, as it says here. So atrial pressure. So what it says here on the original graph that I just copied from the previous page is that the aortic valve opens here. So let's just say that here where the aortic valve opens, aortic open, and over here is where the aortic closes. So aortic closes. Okay, so what is quite obvious is that the left ventricular pressure, which means the curve, the blue curve, is going upward even higher than the aortic pressure, that is the pink curve, just because that the left ventricle needs to develop so much pressure within in order to push open the aortic valve, the actual stenosed aortic valve. That's why the left ventricular pressure needs to be higher than the aortic pressure over here. So that's why we see there is this pressure difference. The in the actual graph, in the normal, so this is normal patient, normal person. Actually, there's no huge difference in the pressure between the left ventricular pressure and the aortic pressure. There's no difference between the purple color and the pink color, but here, if you take a look, there is this difference between both of these. So that's why there is increased left ventricular pressure in order to overcome the pressure in the aorta and open the aortic valve. And so this is the graph. So what it's saying here is that there is an increase in the left ventricular pressure. We talked about this, and there is an increase in the end systolic volume. And yes, we talked about this. This is the new diseased end systolic volume. So it's going this way, so it's called increased. Okay. And then also we have no change in the end diastolic volume because the filling is fine. I mean, we don't have a problem in filling the ventricle. We have only a problem with ejecting the blood out of the ventricle. So there's reduced stroke volume. So yes, there you go. This is the normal stroke volume, and this is the disease stroke volume in aortic stenosis. And we could have ventricular hypertrophy, and that leads to decreased ventricular compliance, leads to an increased end diastolic pressure for a given end diastolic volume. And if you think about it, it's quite obvious because the left ventricle needs to have a very high blood pressure within in order to overcome the stenosed aortic valve over here. So by time the left ventricle is going to be hypertrophied, so the wall needs to get harder in order to push harder through the stenotic aortic valve. So, and of course, if it gets hypertrophied, then it will lose its compliance and its flexibility. That's why we can find an increased end diastolic pressure for a given end diastolic volume. Okay. So the other disease condition is the aortic regurgitation. Well, let's clear up all this mess. And of course, all of this mess as well. Okay, so for aortic regurgitation, so this is the aorta, but in our case, this is regurgitation, so this valve doesn't completely close at all. So there is always an opening in the aortic regurgitation. Whether it's diastole, systole, the valve loses its capability of closing completely. So what happens is, so this is the left ventricle, this is the right, ouch. This is the left atrium, this is the right atrium, and the right ventricle. There you go. So for looking at this graph, we know that the black curve is the normal, and we know that over here the mitral closes, and that's under normal conditions. And here is the aortic opens. Here is where the aortic closes, and then here is when the mitral opens. Okay, and of course we know that here was the diastole, here was we're supposed to have the isovolumetric contraction, and here we're supposed to have the isovolumetric ejection, and here have to have the isovolumetric relaxation, and it's all the same as in this main graph that we talked about over here. So okay, what we have in aortic regurgitation is no true isovolumetric phase. Okay, so what is happening is that this aortic valve is going to always be open. So what is required during isovolumetric contraction is that we're supposed to have both of these valves to be closed. So what is happening now is the mitral closes normally, it doesn't have any problem, while the aortic valve does not. There is a problem in here. So there is no time during the life of a patient with aortic regurgitation, since he started having aortic regurgitation, that the aortic regurgitation is going the aortic valve is going to close completely. So we will not have the isovolumetric contraction, because the isovolumetric contraction requires both of these valves to be closed. And we don't have that in aortic regurgitation. So what is happening is that take a look at this normal, really nice, obvious isovolumetric contraction, and look how it looks like over here. Because now we don't have an acute or obvious aortic opening. The aorta is always going to be open. So there is no actual point where the aorta opens, where the aortic valve opens. So it's going to be a really huge curve over here, because we don't have an actual opening of the aortic valve. It's always open. And there you go, we end up at the aortic valve closure. There's also no specific point where the aortic valve closes. That's the pink circle is the disease circle. So there is, in the disease condition, that is the aortic regurgitation, there is no specific point where the aortic valve closes. We don't have that, unfortunately. So again, we are having no true as well as the volumetric relaxation, just when you compare it to the normal conditions. So there is an increase in the end diastolic volume. So of course, because the aortic regurgitant valve is always open, so there's always more blood in the left ventricle. Like whenever we give blood into the left ventricle, it can push it through the aorta. So there's an inlet, but of course there is an outlet. So it doesn't matter how much you put in, it will never say enough, because it will never close. Whatever you give in, it can always go outside, because this valve is always open. Okay, so there's of course increase in the stroke volume, and there you go. This is the red is the normal nice stroke volume, but in our disease condition, the blue color, this is the huge stroke volume. And it happens because the aortic valve is always open, so the aortic valve is always allowing blood through it into the aorta. So the stroke volume, that is the amount of blood that goes out the left ventricle, is always there. So it's huge. Okay, so now for the other graph, so again, this is completely the same as this normal when we compare it to the normal. So the red curve, the pink curve, it should be, okay, it should be, the pink curve should be the aortic pressure. Okay, so we have the aortic pressure over here, okay, and the blue is the left ventricular pressure, and the green curve is the atrial pressure. Okay, so we have over here is we are supposed, well, remember here that we are supposed to have an aortic opening, normal conditions, and aortic closing. So we don't have that over here. So if you take a look at it, there is no, if you compare it, then there is no specific opening or closing of the aortic valve. That's why the curves looks quite similar, not like the specific points that we have over here of the aortic valve opening and aortic valve closing. We don't have that anymore. So here how the graph looks like, and we have the loss of diacrotic notch, and this is the diacrotic notch. It's when the aortic valve closes. This is when we hear diacrotic notch, and in this condition, we are going to lose the diacrotic notch because it's always open. That's for the aortic regurgitation, and now for the mitral stenosis. Mitral stenosis. Okay, let's take a look at the image again. What's happening? This problem. Okay. So now there is a stenosed valve, but this time it's the aorta. I mean the mitral valve. So this mitral valve is not opening easily because it's tenured, so it's not allowing the blood to flow freely through it from the left atrium into the left ventricle because it's stenosed. So we can imagine that the left ventricle is having a hard time pushing the blood through the stenosed mitral valve into the left ventricle. So what happens over here is that we know what we're supposed to have over here. These are the normal stuff that we talked about. Um, this is the normal black. The black is the normal that I'm drawing in red is the diastole. Okay, there is isovolumetric contraction. Here's the aorta open, and here's the ejection. That's normal, and we get to the where the aorta closes, and then we go down where the we're doing the isovolumetric relaxation over here, and then here we have again the mitral closes, and we should have, of course, over here the end systolic volume, and over here the end diastolic volume. But what is happening is there is an increase in the left atrial pressure because the aorta, okay, yeah, because the this valve is stenosed and it's really hard for the left atrium to push. So now the left atrium needs to develop a higher pressure in order to force this mitral valve to open. That's why we see the increased left atrial pressure, and there is a decrease in the end diastolic volume because of impaired ventricular filling. Now we have a problem. Well, if you look at this during diastole, the end diastolic volume is getting, let me use the blue color. So this is the new diseased and diastolic volume, and it is less than the normal fine, good and diastolic volume. And the reason for that is that we have a mitral stenosis. So when even though the ventricle is filling, there you go. This is the diseased valve. This is the stenosed aortic valve. Even though it's allowing some blood to flow through into the left ventricle, but because it's stenosed, it's going to really fast close again. So it impairs the complete emptying of the left atrium into the left ventricle. So there is some ejection between the left atrium into the left ventricle, but then that happens really fast because the stenosed cusps of the mitral valve are going to close really fast. Like they allow a small amount of blood and then they close. So that means the left ventricle is getting only a small amount of blood from the left atrium, and a great amount stays in the left atrium, does not leave, because this mitral valve is stenosed and is not allowing for proper filling. That's why we see over here the during diastole in the blue, the diseased is in blue. So we're going to have a reduced filling, a problem with the filling. So there's a decrease in the end-diastolic volume. And of course, that means we have a decrease in systolic volume as well, because less coming in, less going out. So less coming into the left ventricle that means less going out of the left ventricle, even though the aorta is fine, completely fine. But that means we have only a small amount of blood within the left ventricle. So only a small amount of blood goes into the aorta over here. That's why we have a smaller stroke volume. And of course, there's reduced end systolic volume because now that we have only a small amount within the left ventricle over here. So the left ventricle tries to contract even harder in order to push. Remember that we said that we always have some amount of blood stays within the left ventricle and does not completely leave. So this amount is going to push some of its content into the aorta because the left ventricle already has a small amount of blood, so it needs to push like much more of the blood it contains in order to satisfy the body's needs. So that is the end systolic volume, and there's also decreased the end diastolic volume that we talked about when we compare it to the normal stroke volume. Okay, so for the other graph that we have, we said that the pink curve is the aortic. That's normal. We're supposed to have it normal. And then the blue is the left ventricular pressure, while the green is the atrial pressure. Okay, so what is quite obvious here is that the left atrium pressure is higher than the left ventricular pressure during diastole because the left atrium needs to be really tough and really hard and stiff and push harder, trying to push through this stenosed, diseased mitral valve in order to push the left ventricle, in order to fill the left ventricle. So basically, the left atrium is going to develop a higher pressure that is even higher than the left ventricular pressure during diastole in order to push open this problematic stenosed mitral valve. So that's why this is, so let's say the 0, 10, 20, 30, 40, and then during diastole, the ventricular pressure is really low, while during diastole, the atrial pressure is 30. So it's just higher than the left ventricle. So for the other disease, and that is the last valvular disease, that's the mitral regurgitation. Now this time, we are having a problem with the same mitral valve, but a different problem, and that is regurgitation. So this is the left atrium, this is the left ventricle, right atrium, right ventricle, and here again we have the mitral valve. But in this case, the disease, the problem is that it's not closed. So the problem now is that this valve is regurgitated, so it's always open, it never closes, it's not stenosis, it's just always open, does not close. So that means there's no time that we are going to face both of these valves closed, which means we are going to lose the isovolumetric contraction and isovolumetric relaxation, because the concept behind the isovolumetric contraction and relaxation is to have both of these valves closed at the same time. So there is no change in volume, but we are not going to have that. So we are basically losing the isovolumetric phase, whether it's relaxation or contraction, we're just losing that phase. So again, we know the normals. The normals, the black normal is, this is isovolumetric contraction, and over here isovolumetric relaxation of the ventricle, of the left ventricle. And here's the ejection, and here's the filling. That's the black line of the left ventricle. Over here we have the end systolic volume. Over here we have the end diastolic volume. But in our condition, and for the valves where they open and close, so we have the mitral supposed to close over here in normal conditions, but we lose that over here. So there is no time that this mitral valve closes in the green abnormal condition. So this is the abnormal. We don't have mitral valve closing. And also we have as well, we said that there is no actual mitral valve opening. Well, open, it's supposed to be here. That's the normal. The red is the normal, so the normal valve opening occurs here. But as you see in the green line, that we don't have a specific mitral valve opening because it's always open. That's why we're losing the isovolumetric phase. So we have a reduced and that end-systolic volume due to decreased resistance and increased regurgitation into the left atrium during systole. So if we take a look over here, let's suppose that this left ventricle is trying to push through the aorta. So the aorta is normal, the aorta is open, and it's allowing a lot of blood at the same time. And the left ventricle is pushing against itself in order to push into the aorta. What we have is that this disease valve that is regurgitated is always open. So at the same time, there's blood back flowing into the left atrium, and that is abnormal. That is something that we don't want to see, but unfortunately we see because this valve does not open always. So when the left ventricle is contracting, the blood just doesn't know where to go. It goes into the aorta, and that is normal, but it also goes back into the left atrium, and that is abnormal. That is wrong. So that's why we see an reduction in the end-systolic volume. That means the amount of blood that stays in the left ventricle at the end of systole is going to be decreased because the blood within the left ventricle now is going into two ways, the normal way over here and the abnormal pathway over here. So the blood is ejecting, the left ventricle is basically ejecting all of its contents back into the left atrium and normally into the aorta. So now we have less blood staying in the left ventricle, and we know this blood staying in the left ventricle is the end systolic volume, so now we have it decreased. We also have an increase in the end diastolic volume due to increased left ventricular volume pressure from regurgitation, so there is an increase in ventricular filling. Well, the contrary happens for the left ventricle. Let me clear up all this mess. And so this is the left ventricle. So we said that during systole, the blood backflows in the left atrium. And meanwhile, the left atrium is also getting its blood from the pulmonary veins. So like there are multiple places where the left atrium is getting blood from, including the left ventricle. So the left ventricle is also sending the blood back into the left atrium, and it's getting the blood from the pulmonary vein. These are from the lungs. So now the left atrium has much more blood than expected. Like it has a lot of blood that is expected. So during diastole, even though these valves are regurgitated, so they're always open, but that means that the left atrium has so much blood to push into the left ventricle. That's why it's filling the left ventricle more than it normally does, because it has a lot of blood within. So why not? It can just push it through to the left ventricle. So the left ventricle now has a higher end diastolic volume, and we know that the end diastolic volume is the amount of blood that stays in the left ventricle after the diastole ends, after the filling of the left ventricle ends. So now left atrium has more blood, so it's definitely pushing more blood into the left ventricle, so the left ventricle is having a higher end diastolic volume. So we have also an increase in the stroke volume, and that is due to forward flow into systemic circulation plus backflow into the left atrium, and we just talked about that. So this is the normal stroke volume, and this is the diseased abnormal stroke volume. Okay, it's too much, and the reason for that is is during the stroke volume is the amount of blood that goes out from the left ventricle. So this is the left ventricle, this is the right ventricle, and then now blood goes normally into the aorta during ventricular contraction. This is ventricular contraction, but at the same time, we said that this is always open, so the left ventricle also pushes blood into the the right atrium. This should be atrium. Right. Ouch. Ouch. No, this should be left atrium. Okay. So now the left ventricle has two places to push through the aorta, and that is good and normal. And there's the abnormal that is back through the left atrium. So that means the stroke volume is increased because now the left ventricle is pushing even more because it's pushing into two different separate places. Okay, so if we take a look at the other graph, we decided, or we knew, let's say we knew, it's better, this is the aortic pressure curve, and the blue is the left ventricular pressure curve, while the green is the atrial pressure curve. So there's a tall V wave. So let's take a look and remember what was the V wave. So the V wave was an increase in the right atrial pressure due to increased volume against closed tricuspid valve. It's easier to look at the graph and look for the V wave. Okay, so this is V wave. Okay, let's look at this graph. It doesn't have any. Okay, so this is the V wave that we're looking for. Now, this is under normal conditions, but in our case, we're going to see a tall V wave. And the reason for that is because the V wave over here represents the mitral valve opening. And we know that during mitral regurgitation, there is no actual opening of the mitral valve. So it doesn't open at the normal place. It just considered normal at an abnormal position. So that's the abnormal opening of the mitral valve. And we know that, let's see, we are supposed to have the mitral valve close over here. So we are supposed to have a normal mitral valve opening over here, but we don't. That's why it looks like a slide more than a sharp point, because there's no point of where the mitral valve opens. There's no specific one, it's always open. So there is why we see this slide in the left atrial pressure, and there's no specific opening of the mitral valve, and there is no specific closure of the mitral valve as well. While when it comes to the aortic pressure, then it's completely normal. We have an aortic valve opening, we have an aortic valve closing, and it's completely normal. Our problem this time is with the mitral valve because we have mitral regurgitation. And that should be it for this page.